Good morning. Good morning, everyone. And I apologize for the multiple technical problems we had this morning. I hope we didn't lose anybody there. But I think we have achieved some stability at this point. It's good to see you all here. So I'll reviewing a bit. We started last week talking about the precepts, the moral guidances that the Buddhas and ancestors have offered us. And particularly the 10 major precepts or prohibitory precepts that are a central part of Soto Zen practice. The precepts are outlined in a fascicle of Dogen's in a very brief form. He derives them in large measure from 10 precepts, the 10 major precepts in the Brahmanet Sutra, which was composed hundreds of years before Dogen. So we'll talk a little bit about the first precept today. So the first precept, as stated by Dogen in his terse style, is no killing. Now, the Brahmanet Sutra goes into a bit more detail, and I'll just read a portion of that. A disciple of the Buddha shall not himself kill, encourage others to kill by expedient means, praise killing, rejoice at witnessing killing, or kill through incantation or deviant mantras. He or she must not create the causes, conditions, methods, or karma of killing, and shall not intentionally kill any living creature. So that's the first part of it. I'll read the second part in a minute. But looking at this, it describes a prohibition against direct killing or encouraging others to kill or killing by expedient means. That's the interpretation of that, as I understand it, is to sort of facilitate killing or to aid and abet a killer. As if an acquaintance of yours comes up to you with a shotgun and says, "Have you seen my ex-girlfriend?" And you say, "Yeah, I think I just saw her down at the Starbucks," or whatever. So aiding or abetting someone who is killing, to praise killing or rejoice at witnessing killing, or to kill through incantation or deviant mantras, which is something that probably most of us don't believe in at this point, but it was apparently a belief at that time, and who knows. Shall not create the causes or conditions, and shall not intentionally kill any living creature. Intentionally. Intention is a central issue in Buddhist teachings. Because if you do something by accident without the intention, it has a different consequence than if you do something intentionally. So this would refer to intentional killing, and we can maybe get into that a little bit more later, but of any living creature, Now this creature, of course, is a translation. It's probably more accurate to say any living being. But how do we define that? I mean, does that include all the little insects, including the ones that we can't even see? Does it include plants, trees? I think traditionally it's been confined to what would be termed sentient beings, beings that seem to have some awareness. So whether one considers an ant to be aware or not, certainly an ant is aware of its environment to the extent that it can seek out something sugary. But traditionally, I think it has also included, yes, insects and animals, as well as human beings. But then the second part of this goes into a more positive stance. As a Buddhist disciple, she ought to nurture a mind of compassion and filial piety, always devising expedient means to rescue and protect all beings. If instead she fails to restrain herself and kills sentient beings without mercy, she commits a major offense. So compassion is said to be the antidote to animosity, which motivates, at least some episodes of killing. It's hard to kill something that you feel compassion for, although sometimes that happens too. Whether the Brahmanet Sutra was actually composed in northern India in Sanskrit and translated into Chinese, or whether it was actually composed in China, is a matter of debate by scholars. It's interesting that filial piety is included in here. That the strict meaning of that is that it includes, basically being obedient to parents, or being respectful of parents. It can also include other elders. And filial piety is a central pillar of Confucian philosophy, which would have been widely accepted in China. So it's possible that that language was inserted in order to make the teachings more accessible to people in that culture. But anyway, you can interpret it as compassion for those who are around us and respect for those who have preceded us. The Buddhas and ancestors, our ancestors, are the people who have led the way for us, whoever they may be. Devising expedient means to protect all beings. And if instead one fails to restrain oneself and ends up killing sentient beings without mercy, that's interesting language too. One commits a major offense. And the consequence of a major offense in the Brahmanet Sutra would be the long-term karmic consequences through multiple lifespans, but also the possibility of being expelled from the Sangha. So, not killing. The Buddha, of course, didn't make up everything out of whole cloth. The Buddha also was in a cultural environment. And the traditions of Hinduism and Jainism long preceded the Buddha. And the Buddha would have been well familiar with those traditions. And central to both of those traditions, but especially central to Jainism, was Ahimsa, or non-harming. So really all of the, what would be termed dharmic religions, make Ahimsa, non-harming, a central value. But also, you'll see the same value in the Abrahamic traditions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So it's pretty universal. Ahimsa was a major value espoused by Gandhi and led to the successful revolution in India from British rule in 1947. Gandhi translated Ahimsa as nonviolence. And that tradition, of course, was part of the civil rights movement in this country as well. One could question whether if Gandhi were dealing with the current Russian army instead of the British army in the late 1940s, whether his strategy would have been as successful. But I'm sure he would have held to it regardless. So when we talk about non-killing, one thing that always comes up is the but what abouts? But what about self-defense? But what about just wars? And some of the religious traditions have gone to great length to try to deal with these whatabouts by setting conditions for a just war. I turned 18 in 1968, and that was the year of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, with consequent massive escalation of the Vietnam War. And it was the year of the draft lottery. And I was approaching graduation from college by a series of flukes. I ended up graduating rather early. And at least in the cultural environment that I was occupying, the Vietnam War at that time was considered a huge political mistake and a moral outrage. So I knew I didn't want to be any part of it. But it raises a number of questions if, well, in any case, what I chose to do, being an impulsive 18-year-old, when I received my draft card, I tore it up and mailed it to the draft board. And they, for better or worse, ignored that. But then I applied for conscientious objector status. I filled out the forms and wrote the essay, and actually went down to rural southern Indiana, where my draft board happened to be located, and met with them and underwent their questioning. Much to my surprise, they granted conscientious objector status to me, something that they usually just confine to Mennonites and Jehovah's Witnesses in that part of the country. I found out years later that my mother had been contacted by the draft board and had written a letter basically stating that she thought I was sincere, a good boy, but would probably make a poor soldier. And I'll have to agree with at least that third proposition. In any case, they granted conscientious objector status, but I was well aware at the time that my not going and not serving in the military was would just create a space for someone else farther down on the list to go in my stead. Someone with maybe fewer options. So it was not straightforward. And if I had turned 18 in Kiev in 2022 instead of in West Lafayette, Indiana in 1968, would I have thought the same way or responded the same way or have acted the same way? I don't know. I doubt it. So recently, after the heavy rains of earlier last week, we had an onslaught of ants. Now, occasionally we'll have ants crawling around the house, but usually just isolated one or two. But this was an actual invasion of hundreds of ants into the kitchen. Out with the boric acid. It's really, I find it anyway, impossible to operate a kitchen that is swarming with ants. So this whole issue of not killing, on the face of it, sounds pretty straightforward. But when you start looking into things like, well, we all pay taxes. About 20% of the taxes we pay go to the military. The military is involved in preparing for destroying the enemy. That's their purpose. We're definitely all aiding and abetting in that regard. So this whole issue of not killing, which on the surface sounds pretty straightforward and easy, is complicated. And I think we'll find that with each of the precepts. It's hard to maintain a sense of purity when you really look into it. So I think that brings up, in my mind anyway, the role of repentance. These precepts are aspirational. They're a guide. But in some sense, we're bound to fail. So the role of repentance becomes central, of recognizing what we're doing, trying to avoid repeating the same mistakes, or if we can see no other way around it, at least acknowledging what we're doing. So I think I'll stop there, and we'll, before we break up into groups, just entertain the questions of what does this no killing mean to us? How can we actually use this? How can we use this precept? So thank you very much. And